Imagine this. It is the year 920 AD. You're standing outside a Viking longhouse in coastal Norway. Winter has locked the fjords in ice thick enough to walk on. The wind cuts through your cloak like a blade. Your breath hangs in the air, frozen, the moment it leaves your lips. You push open the heavy wooden door and step inside. The first thing that hits you is smoke. It fills the upper half of the building, rolling along the ceiling like storm clouds. Through the haze, you can see it, a hole in the roof, not a small crack, a deliberate opening. Snow occasionally drifts through it, melting before it hits the floor. And yet, people lived here, survived here, through winter after winter. This is the paradox that confuses us today. We look at Viking longhouses and think, primitive, uncomfortable, barely survivable. But what if we've been thinking about this backwards? What if those gaps, that smoke hole, weren't flaws Vikings tolerated, but features that helped them survive? Today on the Real Norse, we uncover the Viking approach to winter housing that modern building science is rediscovering. If you're learning something new, drop a comment below. Let's begin. 1. The paradox of the open roof. Before we can understand why Viking longhouses worked, we need to look at what seems impossible about them. Buildings with a central fire pit, smoke drifting through roof vents, and relatively leaky construction that let air move through them. By modern standards, this sounds like a recipe for freezing to death. But the Vikings thrived in these conditions for centuries, across some of the harshest climates in northern Europe. And archaeological reconstructions reveal something surprising. The leaky, ventilated design allowed smoke and moisture to escape enough to make them usable, though still smoky and cool by modern standards. Here's what we're going to explore on the Real Norse today: why buildings need to breathe to stay comfortable, how moisture, not just cold air, affects how warm a space feels, and how Viking longhouses dealt with smoke and humidity through basic physics principles we're now rediscovering in modern building science. This isn't about romanticizing the past. This is about archaeology, experimental reconstructions, and practical solutions refined over generations who couldn't afford to get it wrong. So if you've ever wondered how Vikings survived harsh winters in smoky halls with open fires, or why your sealed, insulated home sometimes feels uncomfortably cold despite the heating, stay with me. Because sometimes the key to comfort is understanding what your building needs to breathe. 2. The moisture problem. Why damp buildings feel colder. Before we talk about smoke holes and ventilation, we need to understand a basic problem that every pre-modern dwelling faced: moisture. Viking longhouses were hubs of constant activity, cooking over open fires, brewing, washing. During brutal winters, livestock were often sheltered at one end of the building. Wet cloaks and furs hung near the hearth. Dozens of people breathing, sweating, living in close quarters for months. All of this released water vapor into the air. And that moisture had to go somewhere. Here's where basic physics becomes important. The walls of a Viking longhouse were typically built from timber, oak, pine, or ash. The roof was often covered with turf, a thick layer of earth and grass that provided insulation. These materials are porous. They absorb moisture from the air. And when building materials get damp, they feel colder. You already know this from experience. Touch a damp towel on a cold day, and it feels far colder than a dry one, even at the same temperature. That chill isn't your imagination. It's real. Wet materials conduct heat away from your hand, much faster than dry materials do. The same principle applies to buildings. When moisture accumulates in walls and roofing, those structures start pulling heat away. Your fire isn't just warming the room anymore, it's also working against the cooling effect of damp building materials. The space feels colder than the actual temperature suggests. This is a well-documented problem in building science. Damp structures are harder to heat and more prone to decay than dry ones. Now, we don't have written evidence that Vikings understood this in scientific terms, but they had something more valuable: generations of lived experience in a climate that punished mistakes. They would have noticed that buildings felt colder when moisture built up, and their open hearth, combined with roof openings and leaky construction, provided continuous air exchange that incidentally limited moisture buildup. This ongoing air movement carried away a lot of moisture and smoke, even if it also meant substantial heat loss. In at least one Danish reconstruction, researchers measured air change rates of 10 to 15 times per hour, extremely leaky by any standard. It wasn't a sophisticated moisture exhaust system in the modern engineering sense, but it worked well enough. The ventilation that removed smoke also helped keep the building fabric from becoming completely saturated, and a structure that stays relatively dry feels warmer than one that's constantly damp. 3. The physics of humid air. Let's look at the science that makes this work. Cold air and warm air behave very differently when it comes to holding moisture. Cold air can hold very little water vapor. It's a physical limitation. Winter air in Norway, even when it feels harsh and wet on your face, is actually extremely dry in absolute terms. When you bring that cold, dry air inside and warm it near a fire, something useful happens. The relative humidity drops dramatically. Suddenly, you have air that isn't carrying much moisture. And here's why that matters. In simple terms, humid air is harder to heat than dry air. In thermodynamics, there's a concept called specific heat capacity. It describes how much energy it takes to raise the temperature of a substance by 1 degree. Dry air has a relatively low specific heat capacity. It warms quickly and efficiently. Water vapor has roughly twice the specific heat capacity of dry air. In principle, it takes about twice as much energy to warm moist air compared to dry air by the same amount, though in practice, heating air is only part of a building's total energy needs. Think of it this way. Imagine your fire is trying to push something uphill. Dry air is like pushing a bicycle. Humid air is like pushing a heavier load. Now here's where natural ventilation becomes relevant. When fresh, cold air enters a Viking longhouse, through the doorway when it opens, through the permeable roof, through the natural leakiness of the construction, it temporarily cools the space. But here's what doesn't cool down much: the walls, the floor, the heavy timber beams, the packed earth, the thermal mass of the building. In experimental reconstructions of Viking longhouses, researchers have found that this thermal mass behaves like a heat store. A few minutes of air movement doesn't chill the massive structural elements significantly. Once the fresh air stops moving, stored heat from those elements warms the new air back up. But now that air is drier, lighter, easier to keep comfortable. This is passive climate control. 4. How the Viking fire created airflow. There's one more element that makes this system work: the fire. Every Viking longhouse was built around a central hearth. Not a fireplace with a chimney. Those didn't exist in the Viking Age. Just an open fire pit, usually a stone-lined depression in the middle of the floor. Smoke rose naturally, filled the upper portion of the hall, and escaped through openings in the roof, either a dedicated smoke hole or through permeable thatched or turf roofing. This sounds primitive, Uncomfortable, inefficient, but it created natural airflow. A fire needs oxygen to burn. As flames consume oxygen and heat the surrounding air, that hot air rises. When smoke and hot gases escape through the roof opening, they create what's called a stack effect, negative pressure that pulls replacement air in from below. Fresh air enters through lower openings. The doorway, natural gaps in the construction, the floor-to-wall junction. It flows toward the fire, gets heated, rises, and exits through the roof. This constant air circulation did several things. First, it fed the fire with oxygen. The flames could burn steadily without choking. Second, it helped keep most of the worst smoke higher up, though interiors were still smoky by modern standards. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking longhouses had raised platforms along the walls where people sat and slept. These benches were positioned in zones where smoke exposure was somewhat reduced, though conditions remained quite smoky. Third, it helped limit moisture buildup. The airflow carried away water vapor from cooking, breathing, and daily life, reducing how much could condense into the structure. This wasn't engineered with modern physics in mind. It was simply the natural consequence of an open hearth with a roof vent. But those natural consequences happened to address multiple problems at once. Compare this to what came later. By the 12th and 13th centuries, European builders began adding chimneys. In many contexts, this was an improvement, but chimneys could also create their own problems. Poor draft, smoke backing up into rooms, and increasingly sealed buildings could trap moisture in different ways. The Viking approach was simpler, and in its simplicity, it allowed the building to function through continuous air exchange. 5. What the sagas and archaeology tell us. We're not just speculating here, we have evidence. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century but describing events from the Viking Age, mention smoky halls, feasting, and people living through long winters in these buildings. They're not technical manuals, but they confirm that life in a longhouse, while smoky, was survivable and even comfortable enough for social gatherings. More importantly, we have archaeology. Excavations of Viking longhouses across Scandinavia reveal consistent patterns. At sites like Borg in Lofoten, Norway, and Trelleborg in Denmark, archaeologists have found longhouses with central hearths and roof structures that clearly accommodated smoke vents or permeable roofing. Modern experimental archaeology has taken this further. Researchers have built full-scale reconstructions of Viking longhouses and lived in them during winter to test how they actually functioned. Their findings: indoor temperatures with a single fire and body heat from occupants, and sometimes animals too, reached around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius in some tests, while other winter trials recorded temperatures as low as 7 to 12 degrees Celsius by morning. Cool by modern standards, but survivable with furs and woolen clothing. The smoke was often concentrated higher up, but smoke exposure remained substantial, and conditions were sometimes uncomfortable. The ventilation through roof openings limited humidity and allowed enough smoke removal that people could function, although conditions were still smoky and far from what we'd consider comfortable today. These reconstructions confirm that the basic design worked, not luxuriously, not by modern standards of comfort, but well enough for people to survive and thrive for centuries in a harsh climate. 6. What we forgot and what we're relearning. So what happened? Why don't we build like this anymore? As Europe moved through the medieval period and into the early modern era, architecture evolved. Chimneys became common. Glass windows appeared. Stone and brick construction replaced timber in wealthier buildings. Warmth became something you could purchase with fuel rather than carefully manage with design. By the 20th century, the focus shifted to airtight construction. We developed plastic vapor barriers, double-pane windows, spray foam insulation. The goal was to seal buildings as tightly as possible to trap heat and reduce energy costs. And it worked for heat retention. But it created a new problem: moisture. In a building that's completely sealed, water vapor from cooking, showering, and even breathing has nowhere to go. It condenses on cold surfaces. It soaks into walls where we can't see it. Mold grows in hidden corners. Indoor air quality suffers. Building scientists now call this the air tightness paradox. We seal homes so well that we have to add mechanical ventilation systems, fans, ducts, heat recovery ventilators, just to make them livable again. In parts of Europe and North America, very tightly sealed buildings have experienced significant mold problems. Entire structures develop moisture issues not because they're cold, but because they can't breathe. Recent research in Denmark and elsewhere has explored natural and mixed-mode ventilation strategies. Studies show that in some cases, well-managed natural ventilation, including strategic window opening, can reduce indoor humidity and energy use compared to fully mechanical systems, especially when occupants actively control. Results vary greatly depending on climate, building type, and occupant behavior. The basic principle Vikings relied on, that buildings need to exchange air to manage moisture, is being rediscovered in modern building science. Not because Viking longhouses were superior to modern homes. They weren't. They were smoky, cool by our standards, and offered far less comfort than what we expect today. But they addressed the moisture problem through continuous natural ventilation, and that's a principle worth understanding. 7. What this means for you. So what do we take from this? Not that you should abandon modern insulation or punch holes in your roof. Viking longhouses were complete systems designed for a different time and different expectations of comfort. But you can take the principle. Buildings need to breathe. Ventilation and moisture control matter for comfort. If you live in a modern home and you've ever felt a stubborn cold that won't go away no matter how high you turn the heat, especially in humid weather or after cooking, you might be experiencing what Vikings dealt with centuries ago: moisture making the space feel colder than it actually is. Here's something you can try. Open your windows wide for just 5 minutes. Let fresh winter air flow through completely. Then close everything tight again. This is sometimes called shock ventilation in building science. It's a standard recommendation in cold climates. You'll lose a bit of temperature in those few minutes. But if your home has any thermal mass, furniture, walls, flooring, those elements won't have time to cool down much. When you close the windows, stored heat warms the fresh, dry air back up. The room recovers its temperature fairly quickly, but now the air is drier, lighter, easier to keep comfortable. This won't work the same way in every building. Lightweight structures cool faster, and very cold or windy conditions change the equation. But the basic physics is sound. The Vikings survived harsh winters in buildings that seem impossible by modern standards. They did it not because they were tougher than us, though they probably were, but because their building methods, whether intentionally or accidentally, worked with basic principles of heat and moisture instead of against them. They understood, through hard experience, that fire needs air, that smoke needs an exit, that moisture needs to escape, and that sometimes the way to stay comfortable isn't to seal everything tighter, it's to let the building breathe. If this exploration into Viking survival and building physics interested you, subscribe to the Real Norse. We uncover the archaeology, the physics, and the practical wisdom of the past. Not to romanticize it, but to understand it. Share this with someone who's curious about how people survived before central heating. Tell them to try a 5-minute window flush tomorrow morning and see what happens. Stay warm, stay dry, and keep exploring the wisdom history left behind. I'm the Real Norse, and I'll see you in the next chapter.